My name is Tiffany, and this is my creative response to types of thought. The testing begins at age 3. By then, most children are at least showing signs of being able to write and articulate their ideas. This preliminary test is far from the deciding factor as to which group a child belongs in, but it does serve as a good foundation for getting children on the right track. Based on their child's results, a parent can determine how much work will be required to make sure their child turns out the correct way. Testing incorrectly isn't something to worry about at this age. Although my mother's hand shook when we received Arlen's results, any fears I may have had were soothed by her cool hand upon my shoulder and the look of intense concentration on her face. I knew she would fix him. Looking back, I know she tried her best. Anyone could see that. When he began to doodle on his homework at age 4, she took his paper away and handed him a history book. At age 5, his colorful stolen markers were replaced with a standard set of ballpoint pens and black ink. I could see her attitude change when at age 6 he failed his test again, scoring well above the median for creativity. The number had only gone up in the past few years. "Mom, what are you going to do with Arlen? He's almost 10, and if his scores stay the same, you know they're going to take him." My mother kept her back to me, but I could see her shoulders shaking. Her hands rested in tight fists on the counter, knuckles white. When she spoke to me, her voice was as steady as stone. "If he continues like this, then them taking him is for the best. He's a liability, not only to us, but to humanity. He has to go." I screamed at her that day. We had always been close growing up, but that day something shattered between us. That she would just let them take my baby brother away without any remorse was unforgivable. And sure enough, when at age 10 Arlen demonstrated creative abilities on par with the Renaissance painters from ages ago, classifying him as a red-level security risk, my mother stood completely still and watched with dry eyes as they dragged him away. Our final conversation had been the night before, when Arlen came into my room after seemingly having a bad dream. His face was a bright red, eyes still dripping with tears, and nose snotty the way only a young child could manage. "Hey, hush now," I told him with my arms wrapped tightly around his small frame. "It was just a dream, and the great thing about dreams is that they always stay in our head." Arlen seemed unmoved by the reassurance, so in an attempt to prove the silliness of fearing a dream, I asked him to tell me about it. With a face much too serious for a 10-year-old and eyes that belonged to a soldier back from war, he whispered to me, "The shadow men left your brains and walked around mine." I felt my breath escape from my lungs momentarily, before forcibly calling it back and releasing it again in a painful laugh. "Arlen, silly boy, the shadow men don't like normal brains, and even those who haven't quite fixed their brains yet are safe because we keep the dangerous ones somewhere else when they're old. The shadow men can't get to us." Arlen continued to stare at me with those haunted eyes, silence ringing loudly around my bedroom. Finally, he moved away from me and rose to his feet, his blanket wrapped around his shoulders and clutched in tiny hands. "Your shadow men are laughing at you," he said quietly, before leaving with silent footsteps. The latching of the door seemed to echo in the room for hours. That night, I slept very little. The shadow men had unknown origins. Some believed them to be a result of advanced scientific discoveries somewhere on Earth. Others believed that they were aliens. Wherever they came from, they had the ability to invade human minds and influence their decisions, walking from one brain to another as easy as crossing a street. Those who were more creative were the most susceptible to their influence, and were among the first ever to draw our attention to their presence. When trained properly to think in a logical, predictable manner, people could eliminate the possibility of the shadow men invading their minds, something my brother Arlen had failed at. When they took him the next morning, our hands had to be ripped apart. His face matched near perfectly with what I had seen just hours ago. My heart felt like it was being taken away right alongside him, and with each cry of my name, the hole in my chest only got bigger. Left in a house now belonging to only 2 in name, I hardly felt like I was still a complete person. Part of me had been ripped out that day, and I was never getting it back. Never getting him back. No one spoke about Arlen after that. Mother pretended he never existed, and I went the next 5 years grieving alone. Speaking of the creatives was frowned upon, especially if you were speaking of them in a positive light, when society solely saw them as a security risk. His name went unsaid all of those years, up until a knock came on our door, just days after his 15th birthday. The officials standing at the door were part of the Humanity Protection Agency. It was a man and a woman who, after flashing their credentials, politely requested to speak to each of us alone. Even though I had done nothing wrong, I felt my palms begin to sweat. Arlen's cries as he was ripped away by this very agency played in my head over and over again. They started with my mother, but very quickly moved on to me. I'm here to talk to you about Arlen, the HPA lady began gently. We just have a couple of questions for you. Did he ever speak to you about the shadow men? His haunted eyes looked back at me. Once, I answered softly. The HPA agents exchanged a quick look before the man took out a notepad. What did he say? I thought of his tears, his unwavering confidence that what he saw wasn't just a dream. He told me that the shadow men were here and that they were laughing at us. The HPA lady's face went visibly white. I see, she said quietly, while her coworker wrote frantically on his notepad. Everything moved really quickly after that, saying their goodbyes and rushing out the door as suddenly as they came. Days later, the news exploded with the largest scandal to date. The headline read, "The Shadows Walk Among Us." The news anchor's voice was unsteady as she told the world that our governments had been wrong, had lied to us. The shadow men never died. We just killed the ones who could sense them, who spoke up about their danger. The creatives, rather than being more susceptible to their influence, instead could sense when the shadow men were present. And as my mother wept next to me about humanity's downfall and regret for Arlen, I felt no sympathy. We had all but killed ourselves.